Hello and welcome, everyone. I am so excited to welcome each and every one of you to Alta Live and welcome you to today's discussion with author Peter Orner. He is an acclaimed author and an Alta Journal contributor. Peter joins Alta Live today to discuss his latest title, Still No Word From You, Notes in the Margin. The book, a uniquely personal collection of essays, has garnered praise throughout the literary world, including from Alta's own books editor, David L. Ulin, who wrote a review for the Los Angeles Times. In fact, we're getting questions based upon that review for today's interview. Orner, whose original short story, Jimmy, is featured in our current issue, will be in conversation with David on everything from his new book, how kind of his process of writing, what he's doing now. He's in New Hampshire. He can tell us about that. As well as the short story he has in the current issue of Alta, which leads me to some brief housekeeping. My name is Beth Spotswood. I'm the digital editor of Alta Journal. If you are unfamiliar with us, Alta Journal is a quarterly magazine focused on California and the West. You can join us as a member for as little as $3 a month and support the work we do, including our monthly California book club, which is free and very fun to join. We present weekly events like this one today. We have a lot of fun newsletters. We've started having in-person events at independent bookstores. So I really encourage you, if you haven't yet joined us as a member, consider doing so. We'll send you a link. We would welcome you into our community of literary and journalism enthusiasts. There is a Q&A button at the bottom of the screens to ask questions for Peter and or David. They're going to chat for about 30 minutes and get to as many of your questions as we can. This interview will be recorded and posted to altaonline.com later today. We are also going to send you an email. If you've registered for this event, we'll send you an email with a link to this interview, a link to where you can buy Peter's book, read his short story in Alta, and anything else that pops up in today's conversation. So eyes peeled for that later this afternoon. And then as we begin, I love to see where everyone is zooming in from. So in the chat, if you give us a shout out about where you are today, it's kind of fun to see. And with that, I turn it over to my colleague, David and Peter.
Thanks, Beth, and welcome, Peter. I'm talking to you from a very cold Los Angeles, although I realize it's relative degrees of cold, given that there's a big snowstorm raging outside Peter's window. So welcome. I'm delighted to talk to you. As I was just saying before, I've been reading for a long time, and there's a lot of territory that I'd like to get to. So why don't we start with Still No Word From You, since that's the new book, and then we'll talk a bit about Jimmy, and I want to talk a bit about, genre and blurring and all of these kinds of things that seem to be inherent in your work. So it's Still No Word From, first of all, congratulations on the Diamond-Stein-Spielvogel long list for Still No Word From You. For those of you who don't know, this book, which is Peter's newest, came out in the fall, has been longlisted for Penn's Diamond-Stein-Spielvogel Award for the art of the essay. A really fantastic company to be in, and a really deserving accolade for the book. This book, like its predecessor, Am I Alone Here, grew out of the notes in the margin essays that you write, that you've been writing for The Believer. And I want to kind of talk a little bit about the genesis of those essays. They strike a chord in me because they are both personal and critical. I've been interested in kind of that. They treat reading as an experience, as almost an experience that you can write memoir or personal essay about, as full and three-dimensional experience as anything that you're doing, so-called out in the world. And I want to talk a little bit about the genesis of the form, and then sort of how all those things fit together in these essays. So how did you first kind of develop this? How did you first start writing these essays? What were the precursors, and how did it all develop?
First of all, it's great to be here. Really good to talk to you, David, and thanks Alta for having me and being so supportive for a long time now. So great to do this. I was thinking when I was working on these pieces that I had no idea that they were going to be anything at all, really. And I kind of thought, well, this is my 7th book. I don't even know if it's going to be a book at all, but I'm going to do whatever the hell I want. And what I wanted was to just like all day long, what I would like to do is write about kind of converse with what I'm reading, and then go back to reading. I would much rather, I don't know about you, David, but I feel like I would rather read than write. I would rather read than teach. I'd rather read than do a lot of things. But I like to converse with the stuff I'm reading, and I call them notes because that's what they are. They're just notes to myself. At least they start as notes to myself, and they started to kind of pile up and make some sense. But that was after a while.
So you're writing, I mean, you're reading, and I mean, I feel the same. I'd rather read than my ideal vacation is me and like a dozen books and a couch.
Right, there it is.
There's nothing better.
Yeah. Doesn't know where the couch is,
Exactly. So so you're and I agree with you. Like, I'm always thinking the things I'm writing are, I was reading a book a couple weeks ago and there was a phrase in it and that triggered something, and I started writing something because there was some connection with that phrase. So I'm always kind of engaging with that. Do you think that it's sort of an artificial divide in some sense to sort of separate, say, criticism, or the first of these books was a finalist, for instance, for the National Book Critics Circle Award in Criticism. Do you think it's an artificial divide to sort of separate out criticism from, say, essay writing, or for want of a better phrase, quote unquote, creative writing?
100%. I mean, I could be snarky here and, kind of what I say in private to myself, but I feel like sometimes criticism is so uninspired. Even when the person is trying to say something nice about the book or something interesting about the work or whatever, it's so doesn't have the kind of energy that you need in every sentence. And I feel like anytime you write anything, it should have that kind of torque. But I find that there's no reason that criticism has to be caged, away from the personal emotional responses that we have when we read. I think that's what's fascinating. It doesn't mean there isn't all sorts of other contexts, political especially, but everything else. But like, if you're going to talk about the emotionality of a piece, then I think your piece of criticism, your piece of writing has to have that kind of momentum and energy.
Yeah, I always felt that the criticism I wanted to read was the criticism that was enthusiastic. It could be enthusiastically negative. It could be enthusiastically positive, but it had to have that engagement on the part of the writer, and the pieces had to exist on their own merit. They couldn't just simply be ancillary to the text they were covering.
I think there it is, right there, is that it's an independent piece of work, right. and I think independent truly of even, I mean, one thing I worry about with some of my work is whether or not people are going to feel obligated to have read what I'm talking about. And right. I go out of my way to sort of be like, you don't really, this is just, I'm just engaging with this work, and you might find it interesting enough to go find the book, but I hope that the piece itself has some kind of merit.
Yeah. So in terms of the collage of the book, in a certain way, I mean, it is a collection of short essays for the most part, 1, 2, 3 pages in length. Most of them spinning off of a particular book or a particular reading experience, but it also, it deepens. I mean, one of the things that I noticed, for instance, in the discussion of Bernadette Mayer's Midwinter Day, which I just want to say, one of my favorite books of all time. I was so happy to see it.
Right? I mean, an insane book, right?
Insane in all the best ways.
Insane that is insane as every day is insane.
Yes. Yeah. For those of you who don't know it, it's a book-length poem of about 120 pages that basically is almost a minute-by-minute recounting of a particular day. I think December 22nd, 1978, a midwinter day, that the poet Bernadette Mayer kept. And it's amazing to me. I mean, I can't write 120 pages in like 6 months, let alone a day. And yet she's also is living this entire, with kids.
Totally. She's cooking, she's taking care of her kids, she's taking out the garbage at one point. So I just envisioned her like the whole time kind of like,
it's kind of great, but you know what? But the thing that happens there is, you have that great essay on that book, and then the next essay, which is I hesitate to say more of a personal, but it's about it kind of takes a moment from that book. One of the things in the Mayer essay is that when the kids go to bed, they find time for a little bit of hit and run sex, and then it's followed by an essay where where you and your partner, your wife, or, like the kid's going to wake up, let's get a move on. So there's something too about, not just within the individual essays, but the build of the essays in terms of developing a kind of three-dimensional portrait of the life. And I wonder if you can talk a little bit about how that worked for you. I mean, clearly some of those essays were written to respond to other essays that had already been written, and others were written as the kind of catalyst.
Yeah, I mean, I think, I know you have this experience. I know everybody here on this call has this experience where your mind, and sometimes you might feel guilty for this, where you drift off the page and remember something because of something you read. I mean, this happens to us every day. And I really wanted to track that idea in a sense of like, and I was particularly interested, I think, in the things I wouldn't have remembered, but for my reading somebody else telling me. And so Mayer kind of, and I don't know necessarily when I wrote the other piece, I may have kind of thought of it like, oh, I got that piece, right? So,
right.
It may not have been quite so, I worry about things being too interlocking, but definitely I wanted to have the experience of reading, generating memory is a part of the criticism that I think of when I'm talking about literature.
Right. You also talk in the book about kind of your own, let's say, over insistence on literature in a certain sense.
Yeah.
There are a number of places where people in the book are like, do you have to turn everything into a story or
Yes.
and I would be remiss if I didn't ask you about both that tendency and also sort of how it plays in the book, because you are creating yourself as a character on the page as well as the sort of the narrator of the text.
Yes. I was talking to a group last night where people were talking about, writing about people who aren't yourself. And I've always thought, like, how do we think we actually know ourselves enough to capture ourselves on the page? I think start there. We're like strangers to ourselves, and so.
Or which self are we even talking about?
Exactly. What fiction are we going to transmit on the page about who we think we are, or who we want people to think we are? Right. So, but I think, I do have this incredibly annoying tendency that annoys the people who love me and my friends, where I'm always saying, hey, that's like something in that, right? And I think the example in the book I give is, somebody saw this horrific thing happen out the window in San Francisco on Cap Street. And I was sitting across from my friend listening to this, and I started comparing it to something that happened in an Isaac Babel story where somebody tramples on somebody, and my friend's like, "What is your problem? Like, can't you hear what I'm saying?" So I mean, there's definitely limitations to this and pitfalls, and I try not to be too irritating, but my students certainly know that. Here he goes. Here's another riff.
Yeah, no, I do that too. I'm constantly quoting people and, whatever. But so I want to ask you about genre, not just sort of the criticism essay sort of divide, but the first book of yours I read was Love and Shame and Love, which is a novel that kind of operates in, I want to say, in a similar register to this collection of essays, in the sense that it's fragmentary. It's a bunch of short pieces that collage up. It's not autobiographical necessarily, although it is autobiographical. I mean, whatever you want to parse that out in some way.
Exactly.
There are definitely overlaps, and it deals with many of these same kinds of questions of place, of family, of literature, of writer questions, etc. So I wonder if you can talk a bit, and you have a story in the current issue of Alta Jimmy, which is a Bolina story that could, there's a way in which its presentation, it could fit in with the essays in terms of the voice and the structure and the design of it. So I wonder if you can talk a bit about the relationship for you, or the narrative relationship for you of fiction and nonfiction.
I think I came to, certainly I'm a fiction writer. That's how I think of myself, and I've always sort of written some nonfiction, but I think I was doing this for a few years before I decided that I could actually, write essays that were kind of hewn, is that word, hewn, closer to the truth, rather than, and I liked that limitation of having some restraint, on the chronic lying that a fiction writer does. I'm an autobiographical fiction writer who is constantly, I want people to think the shit happened. I do, because that's part of the, I don't know, the trick, the manipulation of fiction. I want you to think it's true, and I'll take it. If you think it's about me, fine. Right. I have a story where the narrator kicks a drug dealer in the groin. And I've been asked about that as if I did that. I mean, it's a compliment, So, but I think when it comes to writing essays, I've tried to tell the truth. That's the difference. And I found that was actually kind of exciting to actually rein myself in and do the best I could to be honest. That was new, and that's been new in maybe about the last 8 years.
Right. Okay. Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I also think, Pam Houston there's an essay that Pam Houston wrote where she begins by talking about a talk she gave. And at the end of the talk, someone in the audience asks her, how much of your fiction is true? And she says 88%. And then the person says, how about your nonfiction? And she says 88%.
That's great. I love that. Right?
Yeah, because as you said, even in nonfiction, we're trying to be accurate. We're trying to tell it the way it happened, but we can't. First of all, it's our own subjective perception, and secondly, memory is fluid. And as we were talking about earlier, which self is actually telling this story now, and which self experienced it,
And I'm just thinking that Pam Houston quote, which is so beautiful. Like those 88% are different. Like the content of the 88% is a little bit different. But it's exactly it. Like they're all an attempt. An attempt to get at something, and it doesn't necessarily matter to most people reading it whether it's true or not. But I think it does matter to me and to writers if you're writing from that perspective or not. There is a difference.
There's definitely, I've been playing a little bit now with, blurring the lines in certain pieces, and I don't know, it's just an experiment for my own, just to see. And it definitely is different to be conscious of trying to write what I guess we would call an autofiction, rather than sort of either autobiography or fiction classified that way. I agree with you. I want to say that there's no difference between them, but that has not been my experience.
No, I think to say that I just think that that's the thing. It's like there is a difference, and I think but that difference can kind of be dependent on who's the person, how the writer approaches it, I think.
Right. So. And the reader too. So are you working on, we have this story in Alta. Are you working on more fiction now? Are you working on another nonfiction book? From this kind of comedy, there it is right there.
I'm a scatterhead. I've got things going all over the place. My first and greatest love are short stories, and I'm reading them, writing them all the time, which is why I so appreciate Alta being a place where we can put them, because there's not that many outlets. But for me, short stories are everything sort of grows out of that. And when I'm not working on a story, I'll be working on maybe a longer piece of fiction or the essays that I call notes to myself in the morning.
Yeah, and I would absolutely be remiss in asking you, since this is part of my experience also, how does teaching for you fit into this in terms of, what's the relationship, say, between your teaching and your writing, or between your teaching and the way that you think about writing? I always want to ask teachers and professors this question.
I've been teaching for a while, many years now. I do love it. I feel like it's my job as opposed to my passion. You know what I mean? And I'm not saying I'm not passionate about teaching, but they're very separate. Like when I work I'm on campus right now, but I work off campus. I have like a little studio in a hotel where I hide away, and I'm totally not none of that stuff. And I like to strip myself of the idea that I know what I'm talking about.
Right, right.
And I'm about to go teach a class in about an hour. I'm going to pretend, and they're going to think I know what I'm talking about, even though I beg them to not believe that I know what I'm talking about. I tell them I don't know what I'm talking about because there's so many variables to every question when it comes to writing fiction, especially both. So I love it, but I try and separate the two. There's almost like a church and state kind of thing.
Yeah, no, I can see that. I'm teaching about this in about an hour also, and I always tell them that the only writing rule I can offer them is make it work. If you can make it work, you can do anything you want, and if it doesn't work, it doesn't matter. None of the rest of it matters, right?
And my version of this, if you can get away with it, that's it.
Yeah, exactly. So I've got some questions from audience. First, can you please ask Peter if he plans to collaborate with his brother, the cartoonist Eric? So is that something that is on your radar or has been on your radar? Or?
We've worked together. You mentioned Love and Shame and Love. My brother did the illustrations for that, which were really a lot of fun because we have shared memories. So I could say, like, I need you to draw Oak Street, 1983 autumn when Dad robbed us. And he got it. He got it. That's a whole other story.
It's useful to have someone who has the shared trauma, right?
Right. And he did the illustrations for Am I Alone Here, the book cover. So we work together. Sometimes we don't always get along, so we take breaks from each other. My brother just published a wonderful book about Barney Frank, a novel of Barney Frank's life. So a graphic novel.
Oh, I saw that book. Yes. So there's a question, I guess, for both of us, and it has to do with both my Lost Art of Reading and your book. Still a word from you.
The
question for both of us is: has the kind of close reading that we strive for become more challenging? Why? How? What can we do about it? I mean, I have my own thoughts, but why don't we start with you?
Yes. Yes. I think for me too, I mean, I notice that it takes me time to get into that mode because of right now I could be reading the New York Times, right? I mean, it's crazy the kind of the things we are starting to do with our eyes, and it has to be physically taking a toll on our ability to close read. But I mean, I worship at the Church of Close Reading, and I know you do too. It's like, I think everything is solved with that. I almost think that every problem in the world could be solved with, if just when people would slow down and closely read, maybe we wouldn't fight so much.
I think there's a case to be made for that. I mean, Jane Smiley wrote in 13, see, now I'm going to do it, wrote in her book, 13 Ways of Thinking About the Novel. She's like, if more leaders read more fiction, they'd have more empathy and we would have less wars. And on the one hand, I'm like, yeah. But on the other hand, I'm like, well, yeah, makes sense.
I mean, it's funny, like, you get somebody like Václav, now I'm going to do it again, like the same kind of thing, like Václav Havel. You think about him, like, there was a reader, there was a close reader. He became a president, and it's complicated, and we had a close reader as a president. Obama is a close reader. Beautiful reader, beautiful writer. He wouldn't be so good if he wasn't.
Beautiful writer.
But it does. I think a lot of. I just think it makes you engage with other people on the page, and I think if you go fast, it's almost like you're not really concerned about connecting with people on the page. I just don't know how to read like that. Although I do, unfortunately.
Yeah, no, I mean, I just wrote a piece about, these sort of estimated reading times. Various websites are now putting up a 3-minute read, 7-minute read. And I'm grumpy about this stuff, but I hate that because I don't even have a personal estimated reading time. It depends on what I'm reading, where I'm reading, it might take, there's no way to gauge it. It's so individual,
Yeah, I don't even know where to begin on that. I mean, I when I saw the New York Times did it, I was dumbfounded.
Yeah. I mean, it's like it's the antithesis of immersion in some way, and I agree with you. I want to be able to immerse. I mean, for me, it was really hard when I was editing when I was editing the LA Times book review, because I was just immersed in books I wasn't going to read, or immersed in books I was reading parts of to try and assign to other people. Right. And also immersed in emails and phone and all that stuff. It got easier when I was able to kind of focus more on, operate more as a writer, or edit kind of in a more directed way, which is what I'm doing at Alta, without having to have that kind of wall-to-wall comprehensive coverage. But it's really hard. It's like it becomes an act of will, I think, or something, or a gesture of faith. I'm going to carve out this time for myself to not be distracted and put my phone 6 rooms away and just read this book. And that is a difference, because that may just also have to do with getting older. That was never part, as a kid, I would carry a book, my grandmother was like, why are you reading at the family Thanksgiving? I was like, because the people in the book are more interesting than the people in the room,
When you got in trouble for reading, I got in trouble for reading too. It's my mom was like, wait, go outside. Go talk, go play.
Yeah, go do something. I was like, I am doing something. I'm doing something. Yeah. Are you going to continue to write the notes in the margin?
Yeah, I'm developing a new shorter, even briefer pieces. We're gonna see how it works. But yeah, like literally notes in the margin. I want it to be like literally notes in the margin. So, kind of almost like a glimpse of a thought. So we'll see how
That's
they
cool.
look. I'm
And
not
will it
quite sure
be,
they're
I
working
mean,
yet.
would it be actually in the margin of
That was my thought. I'm not sure
Great.
I'm not sure if it's possible, but something along those lines. But we'll see. But yeah, I'd like to. And now the Believer's back in San Francisco, which is great. We'll see how it goes. Yeah.
All right, we have one more audience question here. It's from Nina. It says, it seems that it's directed to you. It seems that you are working against the conventional Western causation plot. Can you talk about that? Is that too constraining? Is the
No,
causation?
I mean, absolutely. I remember I had a very generous review of my first book, which kind of changed my whole life. It was Margot Livesey who said something to the effect of, this guy doesn't seem to believe in cause and effect, and she said it positively. And I didn't realize that was the case, but she had it dead right.
Right.
I don't think that stories or essays for that matter, or that cause and effect is should be so direct. I remember in law school, I won't go off too long, but like there was something called proximate cause, and I liked that because it was like, it's like sort of an alternate cause, or I liked that idea that there wasn't a direct line from this to that. And I think I've always sort of thought that in fiction there shouldn't be a direct line anywhere, at least not too transparently. But anywhere.
No, that makes sense to me, because it's true of life too. I mean, there are, in some cases there are direct lines, but in so many cases, motivations or causation is so muddy.
Yeah, or else there is a direct line, but if you only talk about the direct line, you're missing it. That's so I agree. Yeah.
Let me ask you, I guess we have one more, well, there are a few more. So this is, well, let's see. I'm just looking. Oh, can you talk about how you, and this is for both of us too, but can you talk about how you sort of bifurcate your reading and writing time, scheduling hacks, whether you're better suited to read or write at certain times of the day? Do you carve out space? I mean, it sort of is a corollary to the question we were talking about close reading.
I got a 6-year-old, so things are rough, but I can't write except if it's in the morning. If I don't have coffee, I'm very annoyingly particular about certain things like that. So I love the early morning hours before the dawn. If I can get my ass out of bed, I will be there. And that's when I do my best work. But I confess lately that has not been happening.
Yeah, I started out as a night writer, and then I had kids, and that became completely impossible. So I became a morning writer, and I've become a devoted morning writer. I feel like I try to save the best space in my head for the writing, and then
there's just less clutter. But I wish I could write at night. I was listening to Robertson Davies' interview yesterday, where he talked about how he was editing a newspaper all day, speaking of that kind of work, and then writing all night. And I was like, wow, this guy.
I don't know how you do that. Yeah. When I was editing at the paper, I would get up. That was also, the kids were in the house, but I would get up at like 6 and write for a few hours and then have breakfast and go to work. And then there's no way that I got home from work. I was like, I could barely work here on the TV,
and all those words,
all other people's words. Yeah. Someone wants to know if you really do keep notes in the margin.
Yes, I love to write in books. Even sometimes I'll hesitate when it's a really nice hardcover that I kind of want to keep. But I love that kind of conversation that I have in the margin. So I literally, I'm one of those people who writes in books.
Well, I notice as I am too. You have been this whole conversation. You've had a pen in your hand. So
just in case.
Exactly. In case there's a margin. I think we're basically close to time. Beth, do we have time for any more? Are we ready to wrap it up?
Let's ask one more. This is someone that read your review in the Times, David, and ended up buying the book and loved it, and wants to know if there are any collections or essays written in similar form which inspired your writing, Peter.
That's a great question. I like the work of Elliot Weinberger a lot, a great deal. Teju Cole's work I love very much. But even somebody like, and I always pronounce his name wrong, but Fernando Pessoa, how do you say Pessoa? The Portuguese writer who wrote as 14 different heteronyms, but he wrote the Book of Disquiet, which are basically notes to himself, I think. And so, you know, there are many books that are uncategorizable, and I am always gravitating towards them. I think in some ways, American publishing kind of shies away from it, whereas I think, like, if you look at it like Italian, you know, Calvino, no one ever told him, hey, this book is uncategorizable, you know. So I feel like there's something about it seems to be a little bit of a constraint sometimes that I notice about American publishing that may not be the case for I gravitate towards a lot of Eastern European stuff, and so yeah.
Okay.
I drop in Brian Dillon also, who's a British writer critic who wrote a magnificent, he's written a number of really wonderful books and has a new book coming out, but he wrote a book called Essayism, which is essentially a book-length essay on essays that is also kind of fragmentary, blurs the line between criticism and personal. It begins with, you know, a fantastic riff on gases on the beginning of On Being Blue.
Really? Oh, wow.
Yeah, so there's all these kind of hidden quoting kind of encoded into the narrative. I really recommend this book.
Oh, that's cool. And I mean, I'm Being Blue. I mean, what is that? You know what I mean? It makes me think. I mean, when you said gases, I thought it made me think of Periodic Table, Primo Levi's uncategorizable book, which is fiction and nonfiction all jumbled up and everything like that. So many.
Last question, non-literary. Peter, who is the masked statue, the bust behind you?
It's weird. These are all over my department here. I teach at Dartmouth, and it's like central casting. The whole place is like a movie set. So when I moved in this office, he was sitting here. It's Dante. Put a mask on. He usually has a Red Sox hat on. And I have a Harold Washington, but he's over here. Actually, I moved it. But my Harold Washington, that's the mayor of Chicago, great mayor of Chicago, two-term mayor of Chicago, is my hero. And so I wish he was in the picture, but he's not.
Oh, you really do have like a wood paneled Ivy League office.
Yeah, it's like a cabin. There's lighting. There's no lighting. It's so weird. Anyway.
Very Dead Poet Society.
Yeah, totally.
Well, I will let you go. Both of you teach at USC and Dartmouth College, respectively. I know there are bright minds that you are going to form and turn into brilliant writers. Even though you both have said you know nothing in this conversation, you both have been like, I don't know.
I would beware of the writer who says they know anything. That's the class I wouldn't take. I'm just saying.
For our audience who has wanted to take notes or keep in the loop with these literary shout outs that Peter and David have given us, our assistant editor, Jess Blau, has been, as she said, working overtime. She's like, these men are making me work overtime. She's keeping copious notes. They will be sent to you in an email. Do not worry. We will also upload them to altaonline.com, as well as the link to this conversation. I encourage you to join us next week. We will talk about, this is the desert issue of Alta. So we're going to talk about Death Valley and temperature tourism with Chris Collin, author and Alta contributor Chris Collin. So I hope you'll join us for that a week from today, Wednesday, 12:30. David, thank you, of course. And Peter Orner, what a pleasure to have you back on Alta Live. Thank you so much for taking the time to do this.
Thank you, Beth, and thank Blaze and everybody at Alta. You know, I'm just so grateful for you guys. And David, it's just, you know, the fact that this magazine is out there, I think has really changed the landscape for a lot of readers, for sure, and definitely for writers. So thank you.
Well, on that note, the lovely compliment from Peter Orner, we will end. Thanks so much, everyone. Take care.